Hi Zach. Unfortunately, I did not have time to script this video in any way, and I don't have time for much editing or anything like that. So I'm sorry if I get rambly or confused at any point or unclear, but I'll just try to quickly get through some of the main suggestions and feedback I have for this video game screen that you're working on, and hopefully you'll find it useful. That's it. I'll just dive right in. Let me start by saying, in general, I think you've got a really strong sense of color. Your use of color is very nice. It creates a very pleasant atmosphere. Everything looks really nice together. So I have very little to say in that regard. The two things that I think could use the most improvement are in lighting and shading. And another minor thing is in contrast. But the overall most important piece of advice I have for you is to try to train yourself to get stronger at working on design and thinking about the things you're drawing or painting or creating. Try to think of them right from the get-go as three-dimensional objects and not just designing sort of flat shapes and combining flat shapes in ways that end up making something that looks good. That is probably going to be the biggest improvement in your work in the near future. Once you get a little stronger at that, and I can tell you're sort of at the halfway point, you're almost there. And it's going to make a massive difference. It's going to save you a lot of time, and your first draft at something is going to look a lot better and be a lot more solid. And this goes for design and shading. So probably the best example for design is this Robo Camel. If you look at it, you're starting. Let's see, can you see my mouse pointer easily on the thing? Not very easily, but hopefully you'll see it. Let me zoom in here. All right, so we have this cool designed Robo Camel. The overall design is nice. It's interesting. Its size would make it seem like it could be imposing, and it might become imposing in battle. But it's also got this endearing aspect to it, almost like it was designed for more utilitarian use, like just general transportation and things like that. So I really like the overall vibe of it, and use of color and use of form. I like how you have the different colored body parts helping keep it separate. I like how the player character, quote-unquote, sprites are nicely visible there. But the thing I really want to point out is you're starting to implement, to sort of emphasize the rigid angled, the rigid body shapes of some of the forms to make it feel more robotic. You're starting to add, which is a good thing, I think it looks good, where you put it. You're starting to add a sort of isometric perspective style where we can see, I'll just sketch with another color here. You can see the actual front face of everything, but you could also see, or I could say the side of it or something, and then you can also see the other side of it at the same time. And you've done that with all the limbs, and you've done that with the cockpit and with this thing behind here sticking out of the back. The problem is you didn't carry this across to the other critical parts of the body and the head. And it seems pretty obvious to me you did the overall design purely as a line, purely as flat shape. And you constructed the overall thing, and then only sort of in hindsight in the shading and detail did you start to add this isometric form perspective onto some of the things. And you carried this over, which is good, onto the limbs. You'll see the back limbs here are many pixels forward of the limbs that are closer to us, which looks really good and gives it more depth. But right now, this overall art is fighting itself because you have two different types of perspective going at once, which makes the things that you didn't do this to look even flatter. So right now, the head and the neck and the body feel like very flat cardboard cutouts compared to the legs. So that's the issue that that you're going to want to fix. And let me just, I'm going to very quickly rough this in just so you can see what I'm talking about. So if you can see the front of this, you can see that this limb, the back limb, is coming forward. It's more forward in the isometric perspective than the limbs that are closer to us. Same thing with the back limb. The same exact thing should be happening to the sort of side breastplate thing you have going on here. So you should see that on the other side. That's going to give the body the thickness too. I mean, if you think about it, the body should have even more thickness than the legs. So you need to actually see that thickness. If that's the perspective you're going for, it needs to be applied equally on everything and relative to the overall, what would be the actual thickness of that thing. So let's just rough that in. I'm going to be really crude and rough about this because I already have another page here in promotion with something I took a little bit more time for, but you can see immediately that helps give it a lot more depth. And then I'm going to get into the shading aspect in a second, but just for general shading, we have a light source coming from the upper left, which is good in general. Let's emphasize that. We've got these nice separation of colors and shapes in the body to break things apart. Let's cast some shadows of the objects that are on top of the other objects. And let's see, even this back limb here, let's really help separate that out. Do something similar there, but to a lesser degree. Especially, I think we can get away with that under the head here. And then the other, now getting into the shading, you were starting to do it here, which looks really good, but keep in mind, different things should be shaded, lighted differently to play off of their properties, like their texture, or in the case of metallic things, how reflective is it? Like human skin is somewhat reflective, especially if someone is obviously sweaty or wet. Metal is highly reflective. If you want to emphasize, which it looks like you do in the limbs, that these things are made of a metal or some kind of futuristic polymer with sharp angles, you're going to want to use what's called specular lighting. The more specular the reflections are on something, the more metallic it looks, and that means that there's less smooth gradation of things toward the highlights. So the highlights are relatively small or fine, and there's very little smooth blending from the brightest highlight to sort of the rest or the medium tone. So I'm just going to be really rough here, but just in general, really hit some strong specular highlights where it makes sense, and let's give that depth the same way you did to the limbs that I added to the body. Let's do the same thing elsewhere, and let's the biggest problem you have right now in your lighting is you're falling on, and this is especially clear, and this is the first version of the domes that you put up for feedback. You've since made a really nice improvement to them after some feedback, and I'll show that when I switch over to the image that I tweaked more, took my time to tweak a little more cleanly. Yeah, let's do that to the feet too, some specular highlighting and adding that depth so that we've got that other plane that you can say. Sorry, I'm accidentally drawing all over the background there. And then on this sort of windshield type thing too, it would be a good idea to add a little bit stronger specular highlight. Could do the same thing here. But you got the general idea. You've got some nice depth going, play with that depth. A more minor design thing that could really help a lot. These are robotic, very strongly hinged limbs, but right now it feels kind of rubbery and curvy because the joints, you didn't emphasize the joints very well at all, and the thickness of the limbs is pretty much the same throughout, so it feels almost more like a bent rubbery thing than robotic hinge meeting hinge. So this is more of a design decision, but I would recommend, oops, picked the wrong color. I would recommend really playing with separating out this, emphasizing this this rounded area. And it looks a lot better where I took my time. You'll see soon. But just to give you the general idea, separate the top limb from the bottom limb. Yeah, that looks really bad right now, but you'll see what I mean when I switch over. Something to really help sell these are two component parts that have this very specific joint here. Same thing here. Cast that shadow. And then if you use a modular animation tool, or just even in something like Photoshop or something to create animations, you could just take an image for each part of the limb and rotate it, and now that hinge is very distinct, the separation of the joints, it'll be a lot easier to animate without the jointed area looking weird. It gives you more freedom to animate more easily. So that's it in general. So let me get back to the lighting, especially in the domes. But this is true everywhere. It seems like you're designing things based on 2D line. It seems like when you're illustrating, when you're drawing, when you're designing the overall shapes, you're still in the mindset of thinking very flat, and then shading becomes sort of a hindsight add-on to try to bring it up and make it a bit more 3D. And that's causing a real problem, especially before in the domes. And if this is supposed to be cylindrical, it doesn't really look that cylindrical. But especially in domes that are supposed to look very, very spherical, this caused you big problems. And then it's also true in the mountains. And what's happening, in my initial text feedback, I said it was pillow shading. And this is sort of a variant of pillow shading. If you remember those old puffy stickers, that's what this looks like. And the problem is, you're making a 2D line art design, like we'll say we'll do a star, like maybe one of those Mario smiley face stars. And once you've got that shape and you want to give it some depth, in everything you're drawing, or virtually everything you're drawing, including the platforms here, the domes, pretty much everything, even the mountains, you have a light source from the upper left, which is good. That's the standard. It tends to look the most natural and give you the best three-dimensional feeling. The problem is you're always hitting the highlight on the extreme left and the shadow on the extreme right, and that really flattens things out very severely. You're only going to get a tiny bit of depth, and what it's going to do is it's going to create the whole mid area is going to feel flat, and then that whole area is sort of embossed a little bit. It recedes into the distance only at the edges, and that's where it's catching light. And that's not how light and shadow works for anything other than a piece of cardboard or a puffy sticker. So it's really important to keep the actual three-dimensional shape in mind, and you got much better than this after feedback with the dome. And you probably use some good references. You did the specular lighting very well with it. You had a nice strong circular limited highlight there. You had the mid area. That was generally it. And then you came in with the shadows, something like this, roughly. And that really helps bring out the spherical shape. I would have gone a little farther and added a little bit of reflected light. It's really a mistake to put your highlight, your brightest highlight on the extreme one edge and the darkest shadow on the extreme other edge, especially in an environment like this. It's pretty well lit. It's atmospheric. There's tons of objects, including shiny metal objects, shiny ground platforms, that would reflect light. There's reflected light. The darkest part of a shadow is not at the extreme opposite edge of the main light source, because there's a ton of reflected light. So what you have is the darkest part. It's near the opposite edge, and then you start getting light again. Not as light as the lightest color, but you start getting some reflected light. And not only does that make it look more three-dimensional and more realistic, but now you've got some nice additional detail, and it's helping it look like a shiny, smooth architectural piece. So keep that in mind. And it should have been the same thing with the cylinder here. You just, again, extreme left, you've got the brightest color. Extreme right, you've got the darkest color. So that darkest color should be more like here. Then it should get light again. Like, even just doing that has already helped a lot. Just widen that out a bit, give this a little, oops. Give this a little more thickness. Again, I'm being really rough, I apologize. I don't have a lot of time and won't have any time for editing. Look at that, see, nice shadow. Think about the 3D forms. Think of how the shadows are going to affect the other things, and this architecture is really coming to life while still being subdued enough to be a background element. Same thing here. Like, look at this, is supposed to be simultaneously cylindrical, but also protruding enough to not be severely cast in shadow by this dome. So this is really the wrong kind of lighting for the shape that this would have to be. So the actual light would have to be here, so that it has time to sort of come out. It's spherical and cylindrical. It's almost like a ring. It would have to be. And then you'd have the reflected light, and the brightest part would be about here, something like this, and then it would go to darker again on this side, a little bit darker. That's the general idea. Remember, I have a clean version of this stuff that I'm going to switch back to. I would do the same thing here. And then the same thing here on the ground. You've got some cool elements, but you're not getting as big a payoff as you could be for these elements because you're still working very flat. In my opinion, when it comes to three-dimensionality and strong shading to separate planes and create depth, you're being too timid. It's too much like currently you're still too stuck in two-dimensional thinking and only using shading as a quick way to sort of fill it in and make it a bit 3D, but you're not really thinking about it and understanding it enough as an actual three-dimensional object when you're doing the shading. A better word is rendering. You're not just adding shading. You've got to advance beyond this idea of brightest light on the extreme one side and darkest dark on the extreme the other. That's not how it works. So in the case of this, everything's good. Really nice color, perfect level of detail, I think. But the two issues are, again, you've got the highlight right at the top, which makes some sense from a video game visual feedback point of view, because you really want to obvious what thing you're going to land on. But I would actually lower the brightest highlight to the edge where the one angled plane meets the other, and then hit that back a little bit here. And then I would even darken the top part here a little bit. I'm not going to have time to find the perfect color, but this is way too dark. Let's see. This might work. Yeah. Darken it at the top here and then sort of gradate down a little bit. And then this will make sense when I show you the less rushed version in a moment. Mode. Let's see, translucent, and I'll pick a dark, dull color. I think you should cast a shadow under here. This is too strong, but I don't have time to make it nice. Really help. This is going to not only make your design look cooler and more eye-catching and more three-dimensional, but it's also going to make it even more clear where the ground is that the character can land on, because now that whole sort of anatomy of the architecture is even further emphasized. Now you don't just have the bright white highlight near the top, you've got a nice dark shadow under it, like really popping it out and saying, here, this is what you interact with, this is what you land on. So that's it for that. And then Now the last few things I'm going to talk about are color tweaks, and I might as well start switching to the other screen. Sorry about that. Switching to the other screen. Alright, so here is a cleaner version of my edited tweaks where you can see I added the sort of isometric depth. I was able to bring this front arm out further to make that all match better. There's actual thickness to the neck and the head now. Added those specular highlights so it feels more like it's a alloy or metallic object. We've got the treatment on the domes. We've got the drop shadow under here, and the brightest highlight on the platform isn't at the very top. And then the last thing I did, two things. If we look at this original here, oh yeah, I should mention the mountains actually. You were doing the sort of extreme left, extreme right shading thing again, which really, really hurt your ability to make nice looking mountains. Because again, you've got this whole big flat, completely flat triangular area on every mountain shape. It just flattens it out, and then you've got this puffy sticker effect, which you brought out a little bit, but you weren't thinking of mountains in their actual form, and that really limited your ability to design compelling, interesting looking mountain shapes. So as you can see, I broke that. I came into the third dimension here. I made specific sculpted planes, angular jutting shapes to the mountains. Now they're more like pyramids, but more interesting and broken. They're not just pyramids. Because I broke out of that 2D form of thinking, and I'm not just using lighting as a quick sort of afterthought to give it color and some depth. I'm thinking of depth. I'm thinking of the actual shapes and how the light hits the shapes. So anyway, and as you can see, in my opinion, you've got the contrast a little bit too low on the foreground, and especially the player character sprite. The areas you can interact with, floors especially, but also walls that are going to stop your movement, are extremely important. The only thing more important is the player. And even in a paused game, one quick glance at the screen, you should always be able to see incredibly easily, immediately, where's the player character, what are they doing, and where's the environment that they can interact with. What can they land on, what walls are going to stop them, where are the bottomless holes or the spikes or whatever. All of that should be incredibly clear, and the most important way to pull it off is with contrast. Have the stuff in the far back have far less detail and use far more muted shading. And blend it into the overall background color. We've got this nice blue going to turquoise sky here. All of the warm colors in the front are the more important things, and psychologically, warm colors naturally come forward in depth. So your mountains were a little too close, and in fact even more saturated than the foreground here. So I suggest you push those mountains back a bit by mixing in some of this teal color to the mountain color. Just to push those back a bit in depth, make them lower contrast, and help the foreground pop out more. And then as you can see, I really, and part of this is obviously just a matter of taste, but right now I think that player character blends in way too much. The colors are very similar to all of these sort of muted orangey browns, especially the colors in this Robo Camel here with the hair, and the way the hair was shaded and rendered. That's the problem. It wasn't rendered, it was just shaded without real consideration for the actual shape of the hair and whether or not it's specular and things like that. It almost feels like her hair is wrapped in maybe this is the case, it feels like her hair is wrapped in like a pillowcase. And it's very muted. If she's blonde and that's blonde hair, which I think that's the case, you really have a chance to make your character player sprite really pop beautifully from the background while still fitting overall. It stands out really well now. There's no way the player is going to lose where their character is. Even if they pause and come back 20 minutes later, at a glance of the screen, they're going to see where their character is. I shaded it in a more specular way where it's a little darker in the shadows, more vibrant color, but then those really bright highlights where the hair would be catching and reflecting light. And I made the shape more natural so that it doesn't look like I said, sort of like some kind of pillowcase around the hair. I also, to add a little more contrast, she's wearing what looks like some kind of white uniform, but used slightly browned out grays. You already had the color in her, I think that's called the tiara, of bluish grays, and I just carried that bluish gray down into the skirt to help separate the skin tones from the white costume. And that just gives the player character a lot more contrast. You can tone it down a bit, certainly. It's a matter of taste to some degree, but that's my recommendation. Really make sure you can always read and see your player character incredibly well, no matter what's going on screen. So that's the gist of it. I also made a completely arbitrary design choice in your gradient. You're obviously going for a 16-bit look, and you intentionally limited the amount of colors, which is cool. I love retro, and I'm doing the same thing with several of my game projects. But just so you might already know this, but the reason 16-bit and maybe some 8-bit, but especially 16-bit consoles would have gradients like this, especially in the backgrounds and the skies, is the hardware could not technically display that many colors in the background. But one way they could sort of cheat is sort of hack the hardware, even though the game might think this is all one sky color, one color. Every time what's called the scan line, every time the system is done drawing a row of pixels, it's going to come back to the left edge again to start drawing the next row of pixels. And in that tiny fraction of a second gap where it finishes one row and it's moving on to the next, you can trick the hardware into changing the color value for that particular color index. So even though the hardware thinks it's just displaying, or the game thinks it's just displaying one solid color for the sky, you can get nice, extra colorful, pretty graphics by adding a gradient like that, by changing the color value. So that's why you will see in classic 16-bit games a lot of the times, especially the Amiga, Commodore Amiga computer games, you'll see sort of rainbow or gradient for backgrounds. And knowing that limitation, one way that old systems could smooth out a gradient, because the hardware, for example, the Sega Mega Drive, its total color palette range in general, there's some caveats to that, but usually it's out of a total color palette of 512 colors. In other words, you can't just make any color you want. It's basically like, imagine you have a Crayola crayon set and it's 256 different colored crayons. And then for your game, let's say you can have 4 16 color palettes. You have to create all of your 4 16 color palettes by picking specific crayons from that box, and you can only use those colors. So the Mega Drive, the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, could not display really smooth gradients, so it had two options in general to make the gradient smoother. One was dithering, which is the sort of checkerboard pattern of pixels, right, to sort of create those midtones, but that has two problems. One, it causes a grainy texture effect, especially when you're not on CRT monitors anymore, so you don't have that built-in blur of the old-fashioned technology. But the other problem is, in the actual old hardware that was doing that hardware trick to get these gradients, these bands of solid color in a gradient, they couldn't use dithering in that case if they were using that trick, because it's just one color being changed. Dithering requires at least two colors, the darker and the lighter color checkerboarded together. So one thing that they used to do is display the darker color and then 1 pixel row of the lighter color and then the darker color again for 1 pixel and then go to it. So it's a sort of horizontal line dithering instead of a checkerboard pattern dithering. And that's subject to taste, and sometimes you might want to use it for the specific visual effect it creates, but sometimes that sort of visual texture it creates is undesirable. So it's something I wanted to mention as an option that can keep the legit 16-bit look but smooth out the gradient a little bit if you want to. So that's why I did that, but it's purely a matter of taste if you want to go that way or if you want to leave the gradient basically a little more choppy, so to speak, or if you don't care so much about creating the illusion of being limited to very specific numbers of colors. Another thing you could do is just draw the sort of seam between it to sort of somewhat represent clouds, and that can also help make the gradient less obviously limited and seem more like art choice. I'm doing this really rough, obviously, but hopefully I get the point across. It just suddenly, the gradient looks smoother because it looks like, oh, the artist chose to make this part of the sky look like cloud shapes in this specific color. It sort of can hide limitations where the old hardware especially could not actually generate. Not only didn't have that many color variations to choose from, but could only display so many colors on screen anyway. But that's it. I'm kind of rambling now, but hopefully that's useful or entertaining to some people. I hope you found at least some of this feedback useful. And that's it. I guess I'm going to sign off. If you have any questions or criticism, or I know in the sort of thread we were discussing, you mentioned something about trying dithering and it wasn't working well for you. It sounded like you were trying to apply dithering to the domes. I actually recommend against it. I think if you want it to look like fairly smooth architecture, dithering just doesn't really apply well to that. It's something that they used a lot more in classic pixel art purely because of hardware limitations and because back then all TVs and computer monitors were CRT technology, which is very different from the LCD screens we're used to. There was an insane amount of blur between all the pixels. So you could create a dither pattern, and the built-in blurring limitation of the hardware of the TVs or monitors would blend that dither down and make it far less obvious, far less coarse of a checkerboard pattern. And if you want your game to look 16-bit but also be as pleasant looking as possible on modern displays, I really recommend dithering in any circumstance except where the graphics will benefit from that intended texture, because now the dithering is far more obvious. The artists back then would not have been using dithering back then if the target devices were LCD monitors, which didn't exist back then. So anyway, I hope that helps. I mean, it's good to practice dithering, but keep in mind, modern pixel art is different because the sort of delivery hardware, the screens of today, are much sharper, much better contrast, much higher color fidelity, that don't do any of this blending for you. And one problem that I see among a lot of younger, I'm an old man, and I grew and learned and evolved from back in the CRT days, and I learned to appreciate the level of contrast that they were working with, and in part to emulate the blurriness of CRT monitors. Way too many modern pixel artists seem terrified of contrast, and I think that's a big problem. Now we have great monitors that we sit, but more often than ever now, people are playing games on cell phones, mobile devices, in very unideal lighting circumstances, and it really helps to have nice clean contrast, really mute out the back layers excuse me, I'm losing my voice, and really pop, really make the everything you can interact with nice, strong contrast, and especially the player character. In my opinion, it not only looks better, but it plays better, which is obviously really important. They're called video games. It's not just to be overall pretty. It's not for any one thing or each thing on its own to look pretty. It all has to work together, not only to look good, but to communicate at all times to the player. Where is the thing you're controlling? What are the things you can interact with? What is safe to touch and what is not safe to touch? All of those things. in contrast of light and dark, and contrast of saturation, how brightly colored is something. Those are the two most important ways to do it, and way too many modern pixel artists, they seem so terrified of nice, bold, sharp contrast, and I think that's a real shame. I think a lot of otherwise spectacular video game specific pixel art, like for actual functioning video games, would look and play drastically better if they would sort of get rid of this sort of psychological aversion to having nice, bright, crisp, sharp, vibrant contrast in the foreground and actual environment and the player sprites. Okay, I'm repeating myself now. I will end it there. I hope this was helpful. And to anyone else who ends up watching, thanks very much for watching.